Good evening, Red Acre, and welcome to the Dreaming Prophet. Tonight, we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to ask you to sit back, close your eyes, and cast your mind back all the way into the murky depths of our origin 10,000 generations ago. Look at the sky, look at the stars, and look at the sun shining down on that upright acre. Watch as the sun guides it, your ancestors, your grandmothers, leading them out of the cruelty of the darkness and into the warmth of the light. Open your eyes, look to the sky. Will you let it lead you? My name is Lavanya.
And I'm Astro.
And tonight we are leading a very special episode of the Dreaming Prophet. That's a joke because every single episode is special and unique in its own individual way.
This is a Blackout Club show for Blackout Club players with minimal speculation, all lore, and a focus on the known facts. Tonight, our topic of the day is the Idare. We'll be talking in depth about this daemon for the first half of our episode.
We are going to get into the spoiler and content warnings. As always with the Dreaming Prophet, if this is your first time tuning in and you are not keen on hearing spoilers about the lore of the Blackout Club, this is your chance to pop on out. We will be discussing basically every aspect of the Idare's lore that is available in-game. So our general content warnings for this are the same as usual: general horror, mention of children being harmed, and to be more explicit, given that this is the Idare, we will be discussing the specific death of named NPCs and the overall death of a large number of unnamed NPCs. One of the core aspects of the Idare's lore is the Cull, which is a historical genocide that occurred in Red Acre, in which the Idare's hosts were collected and killed by Speak as One. And tonight's special guest is Fluffy Raven. Fluffy Raven will be helping us deal with the exciting topic of the Idare and giving us some insights into her own personal views of him. Hi, Fluffy.
Hi, my name's Fluffy Raven. You can find me sprinkled throughout the Blackout Club community, whether it's in the Discord or just meandering about online in game. I am one of the Idare's chosen, and I'm here to talk about him today.
Sometimes we say that the Idare's followers can be a little over-enthusiastic, but honestly, when we talk about people raving, we're mostly just talking about Raven.
Let's start off with the question that's on everyone's minds. Who is the Idare?
When the game was originally coming out, the Idare was more so known for his rebellious nature. An example of this would be when his siblings and his maker, Sao, basically said, "Don't come to Red Acre," and that he was not invited. He ended up showing up anyway because they told him not to come. If you were to stumble upon the Idare today in Red Acre, you would more likely find out that he represents individuality and choice.
And presumably that's been the case throughout most of his life. We don't exactly know much about the Idare historically, who he's been in the past, what he's done, or where he's gone. But what we do know is a few scattered facts from various individuals throughout Red Acre. One of them is Her Laugh Last, who is definitely a reliable narrator. Absolutely. Is that he had to stick up his ass to match SAOs back in the day. Back when he was still in tight with his makers. We also know that even though the Idare currently is not really in with Speak as One or many of the other gods, in the past he was. And in the past he went by several other names who still exist outside of Red Acre. So remember that next time you decide to take a tourist trip. In the past he's also gone by other genders. We know that he's gone by she and her, and possibly others. As a side note, what's interesting about the voices is that they do not have the traditional relationship with gender that humans and the player characters might have. Voices are not people. That's always something that's worth emphasizing, and that's always something that kind of plays into what pronouns they use. We know that in the past, the measure cut has also been referred to as a woman, and we know that the Idare has been referred to as a woman in the past. This is not necessarily because of the daemon's exact gender identity, because they don't have bodies, they are voices floating in the void, and they are not humans. Voices take on the gender of the host whose voice they are using to speak. When the measure cuts was using a female voice, everyone used female pronouns. When the idea was using a female voice, everyone used female pronouns. The voice, who is the primary means through which speak as one speaks, uses they, them, he, him, and she, her pronouns because the voice is two different people, a man and a woman speaking in tandem. For this episode, though, we will be using he pronouns for the idea throughout because that is the current gender as far as we know of his voice. To get back on topic, even though the voices are not humans, they do all, with the exception of speak as one, use familial terms to refer to one another. The idea is the firstborn child of speak as one, and he is the second oldest of the known voices. Per speak as one, who unfortunately is not always a reliable narrator, he is also the source of some of the other voices. We don't know exactly how that works, but in the end, that may just be speak as one being exceptionally petty, as they don't want to admit that they have countless, or 9, children that all manage to think they're the absolute fucking worst.
From a conversation a few months ago, Speak as One claimed that the other gods split off from Theodir and not from the big baddie themselves. However, Theodir has gone against their claims, saying the voices did in fact split off of SAO. Right now, there's not a lot of solid facts with that, and this is something that's being disputed over, as familiar relations are kind of a constant enigma when it comes to the voices. Theodir often rejects being called the title of parent because he feels that it's arrogant and that it denies the role of humans into his coming of existence and that of the other voices. Theodir has stated that he believes that humans came first and were the ones who created voices in the first place. However, despite with Theodir thinking that the title of becoming a parent is more on the arrogant side, he has no issues referring to Speak as One as his makers, which this can actually be seen with other voices, such as the Measure Cuts calling SAO his progenitor. After the big event known as the culling, Theodir was left shattered and voiceless, basically a shadow of himself. And because of this, he lost contact with his sibling voices. As Theodir has been regaining his strength, he's been trying to reach out and recreate a relationship with his siblings and ally with certain voices. A few examples of these would be Die For You, Dance For Us, and the Measure Cuts.
Theodir views Speak as One as his enemy, and until recently also thought poorly of the rest of his family. He speaks often about how his family moves together. Where one goes, the others will follow. As a result, when Speak as One created Redacre, all the other daemons showed up there, even though Speak as One tried to keep them out.
Because, if you recall back to what we were saying just a few minutes ago, it turns out the idea is the spirit of rebellion. The spirit of rebellion, that youthful desire to do exactly what he's told not to do. Is it any surprise that most of his hosts have been 13-year-old children? We don't actually know the chronology of how the voices arrived in Redacre. What we do know is that the idea himself says that he was one of the last of his family, if not the last, to arrive in Redacre. When he arrived, he was then betrayed by Laughlass, who's probably, he's never said it, but we can all assume here, his least favorite sibling. This led to his fragmenting. Fragmentation is an interesting process in which a voice's name is stripped into pieces. We don't exactly know how it occurs. What we do know is that when one voice wants another voice dead, they will initiate a cull. The culls are basically where you track down every single human being that hosts a piece of the voice's name, or the voice themselves, and you kill them. By systematically destroying each host in each part of the voice's name, you will kill the name. With the idea, for whatever reason, this did not kill him. It resulted in him fragmenting instead into name fragments, which then could be found across the map. As of right now, on August 10th, 2019, you can still find name fragments, and we are still finding new ones each and every day, despite the fact that the idea has regained his name and does, for the most part, appear to be fully functional as a voice. What's interesting about the fragmentation is that initially the other voices did not seem to care. In the early dream encounters, the voices did not seem interested in the idea at all. Laughlass was actively malicious towards him. The Measure Cuts was disinterested. Dance For Us, while she could be read as sympathetic, was not willing to do anything towards helping him, or helping the players recover his name fragments. And in initial conversations with the idea, the feeling of disinterest and downright animosity were largely mutual. While the idea now has begun approaching his siblings with a handout to try and reconcile the relationship between them, and also gain support in acting against Speak as One. In the past, he did not give a single fuck about his sibling, except in terms of how betrayed and how hurt he was, in the fact that they had all stood by and watched as their progenitor tried to destroy him.
In much more ancient history, the idea says that he taught humans speech, the spoken word, with the help of another unnamed god, a god who, supposedly, was another version of himself. The spoken word was used to plot in secret against Speak as One. Prior to that, they all used what Speak as One refers to as the Old Tongue, which is dance. The spoken word was also used to give early humans a sense of self. As they began to speak, they could begin to agree and disagree. They could begin to give opinions, and so on and so forth. It was a tool that allowed them to transcend, or perhaps simply depart from, the idea of one singular collective. He says that these disagreements, this sense of identity, might be where the other voices came from. He also says that he invented the lie.
So now we've covered all the history of the idea, and basically the core of him as a person, as a not person. As a person who is disembodied and is also an eldritch leech who lives inside of your head. The most unique kind of person of all. But that's all in the past. What about the idea right now? He is in a lot of ways the face of the voices. He is the one that is most commonly encountered by player characters. He is the one that is the most friendly and the most helpful towards player characters. And until recently, he was the most likely to be encountered by a new player. Back in the old days, prior to 1.0, what the idea used to do was contact new players. He would speak to them and ask them for their help, and then he would lead them to the cave fragment. When they closed their eyes, they would see a glowing man in chains. He would ask them for their help, and oftentimes, he would give them halos. Nowadays, he doesn't do that as much. The idea has regained his name, and he no longer needs all these grubby children rubbing their hands all over his name fragments. He does not really point out where new name fragments are, but he will tell stories about the dead hosts that represent them.
He does do a lot of player outreach. I guess you could say he's the public relations team of the gods.
Boo! The only god who needs a public relations team, if we're being perfectly honest here, is Speak as One, if only they would answer my calls and fully hire me for that important pre-college marketing internship in which I teach them all the ways that they can make their public face more personable and sellable to the millennials of this age.
But do you have your work permit?
Shut the fuck up, Astro! So, jokes aside, there's been an interesting change in perception and portrayal of the idea since the beginning of the game. The idea, in terms of personality, has shifted a lot as he's gained more fragments and as he's become more certain of the situation in Redacre. He used to speak of dead hosts frequently at the start, and anytime that a player character would lead him to a fragment, he would usually have a story at hand. As of recently, he's grown more and more ill at ease with this concept. He's not as interested in talking about his dead host for some reason, and he's gone as far as to say that these stories can be depressing. In the past, he would often say to players that they need to survive, that he wants them to survive and live through the night and not die as so many of his hosts had died previously. Now, increasingly, with certain players, he's begun changing that. He no longer says survive. Now he says survive for me. A little bit of an ominous twist, everything considered. Interestingly enough, and possibly linked in, is the fact the idea is one of the few voices that is reluctant to take on every player as a host. Some, like Speak as One, canonly have groomed up the children of Redacre to all serve as their host. Others, like In Her Teeth, have been wildly flailing at any player who might possibly be open to it, asking them to serve as her host. The idea has been more hesitant. When some player characters ask him if they can serve as host, he has actually rejected them and has had to be convinced to take them on. Others, he has been open and willing to it.
It's almost like a child being picky with their food.
Give him the chicken tenders. He wants the chicken tenders.
Oh my god.
Interestingly enough, due to the Idare and Speakus One being polar opposites of one another, the Idare's presence will often suppress SAO's watchers, but they can also suppress him back. I actually have a friend of mine who has a watcher in their head, and the Idare actively has to keep them at bay in order to keep the player from being taken over by the watchers in their sleep. Initially, when the Idare still had a voice, he spoke to players in the form of dreams with backwards speech. It has improved as players have begun collecting his fragments. However, he's currently left without a voice. The Idare is one of two gods that will speak in text to players during missions. In a dream, the Measure Cuts says it's the only way that he is able to communicate with players after he was shattered.
If you see a white eye closing, close your eyes and listen.
This one has clearly been contacted by our fallen sibling. Your desire to share this data means you might prove an excellent host for me. However, indeed, this is the only way he can speak while he remains dismembered.
I would like to note that speaking in the text form is actually immensely painful for him, as it is not his natural way of communicating.
And now with that section done, we're on to the most exciting part of tonight's episode. Now, normally, here in the Dreaming Prophet, we're a bunch of old coots. We don't deal with speculation to the point that the podcast's entire purpose is to disseminate the true and real facts of the game, to make it easier for players to come up with their own. However, tonight, things are a little different because this is a God conversation, and we do have a player right here ready to come up with their own speculation. So tonight, we're going to set aside our petty grievances with speculation and theories, and we're going to let Raven take the lead and go stork Raven mad with any theories, thoughts, or conversations she's had.
We wanted you here because you know this Damon well. As you said, you're one of his chosen. This is your opportunity to talk about whatever you want.
Alright, one thing that I would like to touch on, because this is something that is currently happening within the community and we're experiencing this live, is that the Idare is currently going through a name change. Interestingly enough, a friend of mine and I helped to kind of really trigger this accidentally by showing him a destroyed symbol, and so now all of a sudden just all these changes are happening amongst the Idare, where he is, although sickly, he is going through this interesting metamorphosis that apparently happens to the voices. However, normally with the voices, the original voice tends to die off when the new voice comes into being, so it's going to definitely be interesting to see where this goes, whether he'll be able to survive this process or not.
So, for players that haven't been on the up and up with the recent hubbub, can you describe what you mean by him feeling sickly?
Basically, the issue is, when I was trying to get this information out of him, is that he wouldn't even know what he was feeling, just that he was feeling ill. And I don't know exactly what that is in terms for the voices, but basically just wasn't feeling right, as if, like, feeling off.
Yeah, I saw a log where he seemed to be unable to say his name, like his own name.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting reading that, because a detail that I think people might have overlooked is that he referred to his name, the Idare, as his old name, and so this was kind of that first hint of him really going through this change. We have known about this for a few months now, I believe since April. It just was very slow and nothing just drastic had occurred until now, so.
Of course, yeah. It's kind of unnerving to see the voice that we've come to see as so confident, who has grown so much, to suddenly take on unsure traits, to become so unsteady.
Yeah, it's definitely scary, especially as this is the god that I've basically followed since first coming into the Blackout Club. So to see him in this state is just very disconcerting and worrisome.
Alright, is there anything else you want to talk about?
I was talking with a friend today about this, is that people are starting to think that perhaps the Idare got Bells killed, whether it was inadvertent or on purpose, we're not sure. Because one important thing is the word and the song cannot exist in the same person. It basically instantly kills them. And so we're wondering if the idea was within Bells, if it's because one had been trying to take over at the same time, that something just bad happens. So there's a lot of speculations with that.
That's all super interesting and also a little depressing. So I'm going to end this on a high note.
Yeah. Sad boy hours.
It's true. Every hour is sad boy hour with the idea. But with that said, do you have any speculation on what his new name might be?
I'm kind of assuming that he's going to be going off this current trend of leaning more towards choice and individuality. I'm sure it would probably be something relating to that, hopefully, unless this changing process goes wrong and we get something completely different, which is definitely a possibility.
Here's the second question for you. If you had the opportunity to choose his new name, what would you choose?
Oh, jeez.
Would it be a bird pun?
Well, I think one time when I was going through a rough time, the idea and I, he brought up sharing a pair of wings. So maybe, shares his wings or something would be kind of cool.
Nice. All right.
Oh, that would be fun. Well, thank you, Raven, for appearing on the show and brightening up our night with a little bit of the idea inside deets.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
Today we have a special announcement for the launch of Red Acre's very own late-night music station. Tune in to 66.6 every night for uninterrupted, relaxing classical pieces, all played live on locally sourced string instruments and located right here in Red Acre. No more pesky commercial breaks interrupting your enjoyment of timeless classics. Why, our music follows you into your dreams. Start listening to Red Acre's 66.6 late-night music station today.
All right, and welcome back, everyone. Now that we're back from that wonderful commercial break, it's time to start the next section of our show, which is, hold your applause, an etiquette section.
Lavanya, your audio quality sounds much different.
It's puberty. 14 and a half is a difficult age, especially when you're going to be 15 in 3 months and you still haven't passed basic math. So, jokes aside, the next section of the show is going to be the etiquette section. Basically, this is not us instructing you on the best possible way to host your personal tea parties, even though tea parties are great, I'm told. This is instead discussing etiquette in the community specifically towards God encounters. Alright, now that that's been said, this section is not endorsed, approved, or necessarily indicative of the developers' views. They are not involved in this podcast, and all views represented are Astra and Minds, because ultimately it's on us players to make the community that we want to be in.
So with the advent of 1.0 of the Blackout Club, voice encounters are back, which is new and exciting to everyone that wasn't here in the beta.
Including us.
We were not here in the beta, we both joined during the early access period. Right now, we are all adjusting to what the new normal of the Blackout Club looks like with regards to God encounters. Not just us, the players, but the developers too.
One of the most interesting things about the Blackout Club is that it is a game that tries to cover several genres at once. It kind of calls down to massively multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft, which often have large-scale events, to alternate reality games such as Marble Hornets or Everyman Hybrid, and to traditional multiplayer stealth games like the ever-popular Thief. Except the problem is, with massively multiplayer online games, there is a large staff for each of those, sometimes getting up to hundreds of people involved in these studios, operating these events, operating these holidays, and helping with bugs and everything else. They have specific community managers. With alternate reality games, there's usually only 1 or 2 puppet masters, but the communities for those are pretty small. At their largest, the ones that I've participated in have had about 100, 500 players at the most. And with multiplayer stealth games like, say, Left 4 Dead 2, which isn't quite a stealth game, but work with me here, those don't really have the sort of community where the developers are actively engaging with the audience the way that the Blackout Club does. Question Studio does not have the massive staff that MMOs have. It has a significantly larger player base than alternate reality games have, and it involves a lot more direct interaction than your traditional multiplayer stealth games. There is no automation, which is a large part of what helps traditional stealth games work. It's literally just the developers pushing forward the story directly with the help of the players. However, Question Studio is unique in all of these, not only the fact they're combining it, but in the fact it's a tiny-ass studio.
So amidst all of this, it's important to recall that the developers are human. They are limited to everything that mortal humans can do.
Arguably, technically, we do not know 100% for sure if the developers are or are not vampires. Their sleep schedule suggests that at least some of them may be. Like I was saying, Question Studio is a very small studio. As far as I know, Question only has about 6 people, and courtesy of our handy-dandy fact-checkers, we just verified that via the website. So they are a tiny-ass studio as far as things go, even for an independent studio. So with the God Encounters, it's important to keep in mind, we do not know exactly how many of the developers are involved with the God Encounters in terms of writing them, in terms of scripting them out, or whatever else is involved with them on the developer's end of things. What we do know is that there's only 6 people, and each of the God Encounters can last anywhere from 10 to 40 minutes. So when each God Encounter is lasting 10 to 40 minutes, and most players do prefer longer ones if they can manage it, and usually come packed with a shit ton of questions ready to throw directly at their demon of choice, like fucking softballs, then these encounters can stretch out very quickly to take up a great deal of time. If you only have, say, 5 God Encounters in a night, and each of those is 20 minutes long, this developer just spent over an hour doing nothing except doing these God Encounters. And that's assuming that they're not taking breaks in the middle of it. If they are taking breaks, getting up, stretching their legs, making sure they don't get repetitive strain injury from typing, then something like 5 God Encounters could easily take like 2 hours, just dedicated to engaging and coming up on the spur of the moment with new encounters with the players.
There are a couple websites that show you statistics for the Steam games you play, and according to one of them, simply on Steam, the player base can peak at around 250 to 300 users every day. At 6 in the morning Eastern Time, when I checked this the first time, there were 84 players listed as online. This isn't counting consoles, and it may not be entirely accurate. If everyone 4-stacked at peak time, there would be a minimum of about 75 games for any developer to sort through.
So to summarize this, there's a very limited amount of developers, but there is a fuck ton of players in this game right now and in this community. So distributing out God Encounters, especially at peak times, can end up being kind of difficult from an outsider's point of view. We've actually had Null in the main Discord discuss how they decide on God Encounters to a certain extent in terms of which players get it and which players don't. To quote him, he stated that the system has a few metrics, but it favors new players, players who have locked onto a story thread that we want to spool out, and then randoms. At times there have been targeted influencer encounters because we want to make 100% certain the encounter is recorded in archive, but in those cases smaller streamers get a shot too. The ratio of guaranteed public versus private varies a lot from night to night, and a lot of activity is never reported. We have to trust that those players will tell their friends, and some will make it to social, etc. They're meant to feel very rare and always will, even as we expand operations, which we will if there is enough interest. But the bulk of our team's work goes towards making the game fun on its own. So, as some player in here put it, gods are gravy. Basically, to summarize his quote, the system favors new players, it favors players who have unlocked certain story threads that they want to distribute, and then it focuses on randoms. So most people do have a shot at getting a God Encounter on most nights, it's just a numbers game. The thing to keep in mind there is, God Encounters are not merit-based. They are functionally another form of the RNG that handles lights of rebellions or, say, bonus evidence spawning. You have to be at the right place at the right time, and then you have a chance of getting it. You're never guaranteed a God Encounter. God Encounters are not merit-based. If you play for, say, 48 hours straight, if you're constantly talking in the Discord, if you draw a lot of fan art, none of those are going to make you more likely to get a God Encounter. It's not merit-based. It is just luck if you happen to stumble across a story thread that the developers want to spool out, and say if you're possibly new.
The voice of the gods that you hear in voiced encounters are not developers, they are voice actors. And they are also limited similarly. They can't speak in more than one game at a time. So if they're in one game, that's 40 minutes they can't spend in another. They also have other gigs besides the Blackout Club, and they also need time away from work entirely.
Most people's family and friends don't necessarily enjoy it when someone is off pulling 48-hour shifts working and they haven't come home or they're spending all of their free time specifically on work. You have to get up from your desk, go outside, see the sun, stretch your legs, do your laundry. Developers do have to take breaks from working on the game occasionally and doing voice encounters and doing god encounters period in order to take care of themselves. And it's also important for the players to take care of themselves too. If you're pulling 48-hour shifts to try and get a god, for example, that's not great for you. If you're only playing the game in hopes of getting a god encounter, that's also not great for you. Building up your expectations for something that is ultimately relying on a random number generator is always a bad idea in terms of the fact you're investing a lot of time into something that may not pan out and you cannot rely on it panning out.
The Blackout Club is ultimately a game. It's meant to be played and enjoyed. If you aren't enjoying it, that's a problem, but it's not an unsolvable one.
It is not an unsolvable one. And it's always important to remember that even if you do get caught in the feedback loop of playing it for this one specific thing, in this case, God encounters, when you do get that encounter, it probably will not be as satisfying as you anticipated. When I was 18, I played World of Warcraft obsessively for about 3 or 4 months. Spent hours daily grinding up specifically for the one achievement, Insane in the Membrane, and to get some specific pet that I can't quite remember now. As soon as I got them, I dropped playing the entire game. I have not touched it since, because I was not playing World of Warcraft because I was super into the gameplay or because I was actually interested in the lore or anything else. I was playing it because I wanted that one achievement, so the entire thing was pointless as soon as I got it. And as a result, the achievement ended up kind of pointless too because I didn't even enjoy getting it. So if you're playing Blackout Club specifically for the god encounters, which remember are not merit-based, they are just based essentially on random number generator and sheer luck, then that's something to keep in mind. The game should be fun in itself. It should not be frustrating. If you are getting frustrated with it, as even I have gotten frustrated with it in the past, then you get up, you take a break from it, and then you can come back to it, or you cannot come back to it. If you're not enjoying it or it's stressing you out, then you shouldn't be sinking time into it because games are ultimately a leisure activity. If you're not having fun and it's not relieving your stress, then what's the point of it?
In conclusion, like Lavanya has said, we aren't making this segment to tell you what to do. We're trying to foster the kind of community we want to be in, and we care about the people in that community. If nothing else, we hope that you'll consider this food for thought. The Blackout Club is made by Question Games. Our advertising director is Bellamy. Our transcript and video is by Lavanya. Audio editing is by me, Astro. Our guest today was Fluffy Raven. Xaviul knows how long the 100-Year War was.